Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk or discuss with you lectures 4 and 5 from the whole book. And I know we're this semester is really flying by. It seems to me we're really whipping through this book at a rapid pace. Hopefully, you're keeping up. And don't forget, you're certainly welcome to ask any questions or oppose topics for discussion on the discussion forums if you like. But anyway, there's a lot of great content in these chapters, especially the one after this lecture 5. So you really want to, that might be worth rereading lecture 5, especially towards the end where he talks about his articulation theory, which is probably what Stuart Hall is best known for. At least that's what I see referenced most often. So we'll try to cover all of this in this video. And of course, in this first chapter, or the fourth chapter rather, he's talking again about this base and superstructure model from Marxism. He says this model defines and frames the concerns of cultural studies. And it's really not hard to see why that would be the case. Again, thinking about the Marxist origins of a lot of these thinkers and thought. The idea of this base, as he says here, it expresses the determination of material circumstances over the areas of the superstructure and the ideologies. Designates nature of the relationships existing between practices of levels within the social formation, helps us think about a complex whole of totality. So basically what he's talking about here, again, if you think about the base, superstructure, the base being everything tied directly to the means of production. How do we get enough food to eat? Who's making our clothes? Who's making the shelter? You know, there's certain sort of material or real life things that you have to have, concrete stuff, to survive on a daily basis, right? That's, I guess, for sort of this sort of classical Marxism, that's what's really important. And the superstructure, you know, everything else is not directly tied to that kind of production. Religion has been mentioned a few times. You might think of education, literature, you know, whatever it is, it's not directly tied to that production. And one way to think about it, and what Hall is kind of reacting to or arguing against, is the idea that this stuff on top of the base is basically unimportant, or it doesn't really have any influence going back to the base, right? Just whatever is in the superstructure is determined by the needs of that base. So again, I guess the idea that, you know, whatever is good for the capitalist class is good for society, right? Just so happens the education system contributes to this means of production, right? We churn out a docile workforce, let's say. So anyway, that's not what Hall seems to think, which is good for us, right? As people studying culture, we would like to have some kind of impact back on the culture. We don't want to just interpret things. We want to actually be able to have some engagement with it. So I think we could all agree with that. And let's see. He talks a little bit about Hegel and his philosophy. It's not really a philosophy course. I know some of you have had philosophy. You could probably elaborate on this a lot more. But it's often said that Marx turned Hegel on his head because Hegel was more about ideas, whereas Marx, of course, is more about stuff or materialism. So depicting historical development not as ideas, like Hegel might have with the Geist and all that sort of stuff, but from the actual material practices and circumstances. So I was thinking about this, and there's a book that you may have read or at least heard of by Jeffrey Diamond called Gun, Germs, and Steel, which is on the bestseller list a few years ago. Really good book, by the way. But I thought I'd bring it up here because it kind of helped me understand how this might work. So in that book, Diamond's basically asking, why is it that cultures over in North and South America or in Africa, all these, all the countries around the world, why do some of them seem to have a certain level of technological development, whereas other ones seem to be quote unquote primitive, or why are these populations so much larger in this area or this zone than this other place? And the idea was it wasn't so much anything special about the people. It's not like Europeans had some kind of genetic advantage. Rather, it was just kind of a coincidence of geography and sort of where the country lay on the I guess, solar spectrum, the amount of light it received, the climate, just sort of lucky stuff like just happening to have the right kind of seeds or right kind of livestock that could be domesticated. So there's a lot of random elements at play. And I think that kind of, if you can sort of wrap your head around that idea, I think that's kind of closer to Marxism than Hegelism or Hegelianism. Hegelianism, there we go, if that makes any sense. Okay, so he says there's three main premises of Marx's base and superstructure model. He's got these premises here, which I think are very helpful. I kind of bolded these because they really help me, the way that Hall breaks this down. So he says that the first one is a historical premise, that there are no universal or eternal historical forms. All historical forms, epochs, different kinds of modes of production are historically specific and subject to the specificity of historical determination. So Marx actually says at some point, I'm not sure the exact word, but he says probably a couple times, and what he's saying, not true everywhere, not true for all people. It gets interpreted that way quite often, as Hall points out. He's kind of talking about a one-size-fits-all model. It seems like he talks like that sometimes, but he specifically says that's not what he's doing at several points. And, too, thinking about eternal forms, obviously these feudalism wasn't around forever, right? That moves on. It's not like we're all following the same trajectory at the same time. There's a lot of fluctuation. Seems like a kind of commonsensical. Structuralist premise, the principal objects of analysis are the laws, tendencies, and structures of a particular mode of production. So if we're talking about capitalism, or socialism, or feudalism, or primitive communism, we'll get more into these in a second, then I guess what we're looking at here is that the laws and the social practices, tendencies will some extent be determined by that. Or we can learn more about that you always want to have that mode of production firmly in mind when you're trying to understand a society's laws or whatever. Materialist premise, human societies can only be understood as a result of the combination of social organization and its dependency on the modes by which it extracts the means of its survival from nature. So the way I'm reading this, it seems to have a lot in common with the structuralist premise, but again, this idea that, what are people eating? Where are they getting their food? Where are they getting the stuff to build their shelters with? And, just sort of basic survival is first and foremost. And you can think about this too, and how different it is to be in the United States and how you get food and where you live and sort of the class that you belong to. And, compare that to, say, if we were in a feudal society, just kind of how that shift in the means of production might really just affect your whole way of looking at the world. Your whole worldview would be different as a result of that type of economy, right? And again, this is what Marx was saying, or at least this is what Hall is saying that Marx is saying. So we'll complicate this picture throughout these chapters. So societies begin when men and women enter into definite relations that are independent of their will. So you don't necessarily get to say, okay, I want to be born into a rich family and be a part of a capitalist class. Right? You don't get to make that choice. You're just kind of born into a certain relation in society, and you really can't do much about it, right? You're kind of stuck there. Now, I guess you could contrast this view, and he talks about subjects and agency, radical displacement, decentering. So you could contrast this view with something like the great person view of history, where it's all about great people, and they can, the sort of society shaped around these great persons that have this great magnetism or whatever it is, versus this idea where the people really don't matter. Individuals are insignificant in this picture, right? Because really what you're looking at is this picture that emerges by comparing these relations between the capitalist class, the proletariat, the workers. That's really what you want to look at. So men and women belong within a historically specific structure of definite social relations, especially those relations of production. So where are you on this? Are you a worker that makes a small piece that goes into this car, manufacturing a car, let's say? Are you running the factory? A lot of this classical Marxism makes it's a lot easier to grasp, I think, if you just think about a factory and a factory owner and the workers, something like Henry Ford. It gets a little harder to manage, I think, once you get more into like big corporations and everything. Anyway, I thought I would list these out because Hall mentions this a few times, but he doesn't list them, at least not that I recall, the stages of development. So if you look at throughout Marx, just look at Wikipedia, you can see that there's this idea that societies shift from primitive communism, you think like a tribal society, then there might be a slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and then from capitalism we would get socialism, and then finally communism. So in a way, this being like looking at this model, yeah, you'd rather be in that communism 2.6. That's sort of the ultimate society, right? Versus nobody would want to be in a slave society or primitive communism. Again, I guess unless you're at the top of the hierarchy. I guess one way to think about this too might be a flattening of a hierarchy. So with the communism, you get the best distribution of wealth and power versus, the lower you go, the more skewed it is. And to make a point here about technological determinism, which this is another term you come across all the time. And the idea basically is if you're a technological determinist, you think what's really important is the technology that people have invented and are using, right? So you invent a steel plow, or you invent the horse harness or the horse plow, whatever, or I guess an iPhone, mobile technologies, whatever. And this technology is what really changes the society. And so it's all about the technology in this view. Once we get the gunpowder, that's what's really key. The gunpowder, not the people using the gunpowder. That's less significant than the technology itself, right? So Hall says that's not what Marx is advocating. He says really whatever the technology, a particular level of technology is itself the result of social relations interacting with other kinds of productive forces. And you can see this in like Diffusion of Innovations, if you've read that book. You could have a quote-unquote better technology come out. Maybe it's vaccines. These vaccines might save a lot of lives and be great for the people running the factories as well as the workers, right? But just that existence of such a thing is irrelevant if it's not embraced by society. If people are skeptical of it or suspicious of it, or there's some social reason why it doesn't get picked up. That can happen, and frequently does happen, regardless of the alleged superiority, quote unquote, of the technology. He says we also need to be careful with the word economic, and obviously, if you talk to economists, they might know a little about Marx. They're probably not using the same sort of Marxist frameworks. Probably very unlikely the way Marx uses it. Okay, not really that important for us since this is not an economics class. Okay, let's see. Where do we want to move on from this? Okay, yeah. So now we're talking about historical changes. And so again, as a cultural analyst, somebody studying cultures, obviously they shift quite a bit. Think about Europe moving from this feudal society into the capitalist society or the Industrial Revolution, all these big historical changes. With this, if you're looking at this base superstructure framework, how can you use that to explain this change? Well, Hall says it kind of fails to do so, right? It fails to acknowledge the real complexity of determination For example, Hall talks about religion in the feudal societies and complicates this picture, right? So religion's not just the opiate of the masses, according to Hall. That's a very reductionist or reductivist view. It's too simplistic to think that way. And this actually kind of feeds back in. And he lists a couple of examples where legal things or political reasons might actually come into conflict with, just because something would be good for the factory owners, maybe a law gets passed that harms them, but still gets passed, right? So how do you explain that sort of thing happening? Or the same thing with religion. And there's a couple different ways within the model, I guess, that Marxists have tried to apply it. This idea that, well, really the means of production does determine everything else, but it's just the way that it works is a little more complicated. So it'll sort of let one of these factors, religion in the feudal society, or I guess politics in another society, whatever it is, it'll sort of let that one have dominance for a while, but it's still what's deciding what's dominant. So in a way, that makes it dominant, right? It's, I guess, the kingmaker factor. I don't know. It's kind of a little confusing, I suppose, but I guess it sort of shows you why sometimes a model, you love this model so much, you keep wanting to use it, even though you kind of have to keep introducing little stopgap measures, I guess, to make it work. Kind of reminds me of the when Copernicus came on the scene with the Copernican revolution, the idea that the sun was the center of the solar system and we orbited the sun. Before that was a very elegant, simple model. But before that, they had this model that was the opposite, right? The Earth was seen as the center and the sun orbited that. And they were able to make this work actually with all these little sort of caveats and complexities and say, well, you have these little sort of orbits within orbits, and it sort of worked out mathematically, but really it was just a lot simpler when you just kind of got rid of that idea and shifted the center. To me, I see something similar going on here with this base and superstructure model. It's kind of like saying, well, you keep wanting to make that base the means of production and say everything orbits around that, and we sort of have to make all these little concessions and complexities to make that model work out. Whereas really, if you just displace that, decenter it, then everything starts to fit into place a lot more neatly without the need for all of this complicated, sort of jury rigging of that model. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, yeah, this is important. So he talks about two reductionisms that take place within this model. First, economic reductionism, and again, we've discussed this concept several times. The base is really the content of those other levels. The base generates those other levels, fills them with content. The other levels have no real effects. And I was thinking of that phrase, it's the economy, stupid. We still see people that have this idea with the modern politics, right? They'll say, forget about all of this other stuff. All that really matters is what's good for the economy. If the economy is running smoothly, then all this other junk is irrelevant. So I guess that would be one way to sort of get at this concept. The other one is class reductionism. And he says that's the ascription of whole ideologies to whole classes, necessary and intrinsic relation between ideas and classes. In other words, if you're a prole or you're sort of a worker, you should have this kind of ideology, right? Because you're the workers, working class believes this, ruling class believes this. It's just, again, sort of saying that since you're part of this class and you must fit the profile, right? Class profiling, I guess. And if you don't, you just, you must have a false consciousness, not recognizing their true interest. So if you're a worker in a capitalist society and you're okay and you think it's great to be in this society, even though you don't have a lot of money and you've got no upward mobility or whatever it is, no real influence, that must be because you've sort of been brainwashed. If you only had if you could only see what's really going on, then you would recognize your position in the Marxist class struggle. And Hall has a fabulous comeback to this, and a couple people pull up. I saw this, I forget who it was. Somebody pointed this out in their nuggets, this quotation. So Hall says, I wonder how it is that all the people I know are absolutely convinced that they are not in false consciousness, but can tell at the drop of a hat that everybody else is. One of my professors used to talk about us. We talked about Althusser, and he said, well, think about yourself as a goldfish in a goldfish bowl. And you just think that that world within the goldfish bowl is the world, and there's no way to get outside of the bowl and see what's really going on, right? We're all in the fish bowl. So, of course, the question is, well, if that's true, then how do you know that we're in a fish bowl, right? How did you get outside? Well, just kind of enlightened that way, I suppose. You just think about it for a few minutes. It doesn't really hold up very well, that idea. Again, Matrix, another way to think about it, the red pill and the blue pill, same sort of idea. And well, Hall says that all ideologies which have ever organized men and women organically have something true about them. They may accentuate certain things at the expense of others, so it's not that they're all the same, of course, but not in the false sense of simply being lies. So I think this is a helpful way to look at this. I guess what you want to avoid at all costs is the, sort of an ethnocentric view, or a view of your own intellectual superiority or insights. And instead, just think about it more comparatively, or relatively is another term we'll come up to here in a minute. But, I like this idea. So all ideologies, there's no one that you just say, that's the false ideology. Right? These people have been brainwashed, and their whole life is nothing but lies. That's a silly way to look at it. There's something true about it, or it would just, I guess, fall apart of its own, under its own weight, maybe. Okay, I'll move on just a little bit, and then we can respond to some of these thoughts. And then another big concern here, again, is in ideas versus material, the material world, stuff versus concepts, I suppose. He says, Marx wanted to prove that you need the material world, and you need to understand how people organize to reproduce their material existence. So not just that march of ideas with no direct connection to the real world. This is kind of heady philosophical stuff here that I don't feel like we really need to get too deep into the weeds on this stuff. And Hall says it really doesn't matter anyway, because no matter how firmly you try to stay rooted in materialism, you end up slipping into ideas or idealism. And that's because idealism is the most powerfully available language for talking about complexity. And he says that Marx really didn't get a firm enough handle on the difference here, that the relationship between stuff and ideas was inadequately theorized. And he goes into all this stuff about Marx's levels of abstraction and how he would sometimes be very abstract, sometimes very concrete. It's kind of shifting around in his different books. So it gets to be very complicated. I think this is probably the takeaway here I've got in bold. Marx observes that theory is not simply given in the nature of the facts at which you are looking. So theory not simply given in the nature of the facts at which you are looking. Theory is an operation on the facts, on the evidence. By necessity, one has to break into the evidence through the formation of concepts, as you can't just look at the data in the raw, as it were, the data in and of itself. We're always sort of coming to it by forming concepts, categorizing. We can't just look at it directly. To make any sense of it, we have to start applying abstractions. On the other hand, he says theory is never totally devoid of reference to the real world, far from it. So I guess what we're saying here is you can't have a theory that's nothing but theory, and you can't have data or material that's just material. It's always some kind of relationship between those two. He says Marx tries to cut into the thick texture of social life and historical experience with clearly formulated concepts and extractions to produce what he calls the concrete in thought. So this term sounds a little bit oxymoronic, the concrete in thought. I mean, think about that for a minute. So how could you have thought, that's concrete? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense just on the face of it, but I'll pause here. So what do you think about these ideas about theory and material, theory being an operation on the facts, theory also being totally devoid of reference to the real world? Let's just simplify this question. What do you make of this idea of the concrete in thought? Okay, I think we can skip to the very end of this chapter. It's just showing up above here where Marx, again, kind of shifts around in his levels of abstraction. Hall says we have to do more than just simply incorporate the determinations that Marx left out, such as race, ethnicity, and gender. Again, sort of one-size-fits-all model. Like, well, it doesn't matter if it's, what race or ethnicities you're talking about. Just look at the means of production. Just look at the means of production. The other stuff is irrelevant. So Hall says you can't just say, well, I know what we can do. Let's just plug in. Let's just start factoring this other stuff in and it'll work. He says, actually, it's going to be more complicated than that. He says the mode of production, what it really does, the only thing it really does, is establish certain limits within which the political relates to the economic, that it sets limits and open possibilities, possible forms, including some that were not tried during that time. So this is certainly a more nuanced view. Okay, now moving into this lecture 5, Marxist Structuralism, and he's focused here on Althusser. And if you've come across Althusser before, it's probably the idea of RSAs and ISAs. So just briefly, we talked about this idea a few times. Why is it that the workers, if you read the Communist Manifesto, there's kind of this prophecy that, eventually the workers are going to wise up, they're going to wake up, see how they're being exploited, and rise up, take over the means of production, and we'll be in this sort of idealistic communism, communist society, right? Everything will be wonderful. But it doesn't happen, right? And, how is it that that happens? How is it that the capitalism lingers on and on? And there's this idea of, it's repression. The state has apparatuses to keep people repressed. The police, army. You go to jail if you decide that you don't want to pay your taxes, you don't want to work. You might end up in jail, right? You just sort of physical force at play, or somebody might come and just shoot you. But Althusser's breakthrough was, that's sort of the last resort, result. Yeah, I had it right the first time. The last resort. An effective society doesn't want to have to rely on that. Instead, you want to have the ideological state apparatus do most of the work. And that could be everything from the way people are schooled, what they're hearing in church, the movies they watch, stories they read. It's all of these apparatuses that sort of keep you from having to be shot or put in jail. And I guess it's a way to kind of repress ourselves more mentally or socially than to always have to have somebody pointing a gun or cracking a whip at us or whatever the case may be. So that's sort of how most people understand Althusser's contribution to all this. But of course, Hall's going to go much deeper into this. And again, he's focused on the base superstructure model. And he says here he's less worried about whether a text is the true Marx, what is canon. I guess he says that Althusser kind of holds up Marx as a talisman. If you can find it somewhere in Marx, it must be true. Everything is already there in Marx. And he doesn't put it in these words, but I really get the sense what Hall's talking about here is kind of how people take something as gospel, right? So they'll sort of interpret verses in such a way as to jive with whatever's going on with reality. No matter how much they have to kind of pick and choose or sort of warp what's actually there on the page, how much they have to bend the wording or whatever, they want to be able to say, look, it's already there. Marx was right. Of course, Marx is right. We can trust this because it's in Marx. So Hall definitely wants to distance himself from this kind of yellow dog Marxism. And he does this to some extent by criticizing Althusser. I guess he feels like Althusser did that a little too much, a little too faithful to Marx. He says he wants to focus on three main areas: the problem of the subject, nature of the social formation, and the theory of determination. And again, these are all really important, again, not just for people that want to understand culture, but coming from a leftist, sort of Marxist orientation, of course you don't want to just say, well, here's how it is, and here's how it came to be this way. You're always thinking ahead as, well, how can we improve this? How can we intervene? How can we have some kind of effects on the culture, society, to make things more equitable, to get closer to this, I guess, I don't want to say utopian vision, but anyway, how can we make things more utopian? Okay, so we have the decentering of the subject. And of course, Marx resisted the notion of fully transitive historical agent. So it's not as though you can get outside of these conditions that you find yourself in. He talks about processes without a subject. So that's kind of interesting too. So again, if you think about these different levels of abstraction within Marx, there is a level of abstraction where the people just disappear entirely. You're not looking at individuals. You're just looking at systems or relations or processes. And to some extent, you could just take the people out completely. And he says this is kind of like the looking at language. We talked about Levi-Strauss or Saussure, in this idea that, yeah, we can use the language, but we didn't create the language ourselves, right? We're just sort of we learn the language and then we can use the language. And the same thing with myths. The myth maker is not so much creating myths as being part of this discourse of myths, sort of using the myths that are there. And yeah, there's an infinite variation within that, but you're still kind of constrained by something that you didn't make, something that was already there. And I guess you could say this about social relations in general. And he says Althusser is kind of stuck. He only looks at Marx at that highest level of abstraction, which of course is inadequate. We're looking at complex social formations, historical epochs. Let's see. It says Althusser does offer a conception of the totality as a necessarily and an irreducibly complex structure. So the social totality is just so complicated, we can't reduce it to humanism or historicism. You kind of wonder, this seems to me like a common enough ploy with theory, just to say that, whatever it is we're studying, it's just so darn complex. We can never really even get a handle on it, and that's just kind of how it is. I don't know really what to make of that, or the usefulness of that is, other than, I guess, admitting that, it's beyond us. He talks about the problems of determination. So again, what can you really do about the situation you find yourself in? Talks about overdetermination and relative autonomy. So I thought this idea of overdetermination was interesting. So he gives a couple different ways to get at the concept of Freud's interpretation of dreams being one. So an idea in itself, or an idea can be the condensation of a set of different chains of meaning which are not manifest in the way in which the symbol is given. So if you read Freud's interpretation of dreams, if you dream about a whale, or you dream about a goldfish, a goldfish bowl or whatever, it's not that's, what does that mean? What is your subconscious or unconscious trying to tell you or reveal? Well, it's probably nothing to do with a literal goldfish, and it could be several different chains of meaning. It's almost, you could talk about it all day and from different angles on it. And I guess that's sort of the idea of being overdetermined. The same symbol can be determined at different levels by different kinds of discourses. So maybe you know somebody named Fish. You've been really reading Stanley Fish, and it could be just kind of a pun or something like that. So the dream could be a sort of a pun. It has to be one level, or it could be something very metaphorical and deep, if you will. And I always love thinking about this stuff, interpreting dreams. It's a lot of fun. You really should read Freud's interpretation of dreams if you get a chance. It's a really fun read. In relative autonomy, so again, thinking about all the social practices and how do they tie back into the means of production. And so it says this idea of relative autonomy seems, again, kind of a way to sort of jury-rig this model. So the real content of a practice is not given by some economic realm outside of the practice. The practice is not simply an empty form whose truth is guaranteed by the economic factor. That is the force of autonomy. The relative aspect that we're talking about here is to deny that such practices could be analyzed as if they were outside the structuring effect of the social relations of production. Every practice has its own forms, its own relations, but its specificity is defined by the fact that it has real effects on the reproduction or the non-reproduction of a particular mode of production. So again, yeah, we're going to kind of fudge around with this, but really it all comes back to the mode of production through a couple of detours, I suppose. So in the last instance, it all is recuperated back into the mode of production. So if you're an Althusserian, I guess you buy into all this, but Hall says basically, no, it's bunk. There are plenty of resolutions that are well outside of the mode of productions. He gives some examples. Political resolutions might set a limit on the mode of production. Relative autonomy is also not a good fix for this. It doesn't always come back to the mode of production. The economic determines, or be determining which of the other levels of practice shall dominate in terms of its effectivity. So anyway, I guess this would be another good spot to pause here. I don't want to jump into the criticism before we really appreciate what Althusser is saying. So what do you think about this idea that basically ideology always comes back to the mode of production? Would you agree with Althusser on this? Why or why not? All right, so moving on, he talks about Althusser distinguishing between science and ideology. But then we get into the really key part of this chapter, or the book, really. And again, this idea of articulation. So if you know anything about Stuart Hall, if you ever go to a panel where they're talking about Hall, somebody's going to talk about articulation theory. That's huge. So I really just wanted to dilate on these passages and really just read the whole thing and focus on this very carefully, what Hall is saying. So we're talking about, again, articulation. So he says, by articulation. This is on page 122. I mean the form or connection or link that can make a unity of two different elements under certain conditions. So might be a little vague at first, but form or connection or a link that can make a unity of two different elements under certain conditions. It is a linkage which is not necessary, determined, absolute, and essential for all times. So at any time it could break. It's always a temporary link. It requires the particular conditions of existence to appear at all. And so one has to ask, under what circumstances can a connection be formed or made? So the so-called unity of a discourse, for example, is really the articulation of different distinct elements which can be rearticulated in different ways because they have no necessary belongingness. And articulation has to be positively sustained by specific processes. And so that's another key idea. So when stuff comes together, it won't stay together unless there's something there keeping it together. Right? It has to be an active process, not eternal, but constantly having to be renewed. Once an articulation is made, the two practices can function together not as an immediate identity, but as distinctions within a unity. So, a lot of this will become clearer as we go further along into Hall, but let's just try to get this concept down. So read this passage again and again on page 122 until it sort of starts to click for you what he's talking about. We're obviously at a very abstract level here, but just keep coming back to this idea of articulation, and these linkages that can come together for a while under certain conditions, but at any moment snap apart. There's no sort of law that says they have to come together. Nothing like that. So there's a lot of coincidence or specificity involved here. So articulation is a theory of no necessary belongingness, which requires us to think the contingent, non-necessary connections between and among different social practices and social groups. So if we think back to this idea, well, you're in this class, so you necessarily have this ideology. Nothing like that in this model. And he differentiates it from Derrida. I don't know if you're familiar with him, so I don't see any reason to go too deeply into him at the moment. But this idea that there's no fixing, or that everything is about slippage. He says there would be no meaning at all if you take that to the extreme. But anyway, I'll leave that to you to ponder if you are familiar with Derrida. Wrong and right. So he says he's not talking about necessarily no correspondence. Or he says it's wrong to say there's necessarily no correspondence between, I guess if you're talking about words and language, between a word or the signified and the signifier or something like that. It's not that there's necessarily no correspondence. It's just that there's no necessary correspondence. So if you want to think about language, the word apple, what does it have to do with the actual artifact of an apple? So I guess one way to look at it, well, there's necessarily no correspondence. It's completely arbitrary. There's no correspondence at all. How could there be? So he says that's not the view he's advocating here. Instead, there's no necessary correspondence. So it's these ideas seem very similar, but see if you can ponder it until you get the distinction there between that. Necessarily no correspondence versus no necessary correspondence. There is no law which guarantees that the ideology of a class is already and unequivocally given in or even corresponds to the position that class holds in the economic relations of capitalist production. So just because you're part of a class, that doesn't mean you're going to be under any particular ideology. And it just kind of makes sense in and of itself, right? Why would you be? Again, we all think that everybody else is brainwashed. It is, the herd mentality, everybody's sheeple. I'm surrounded by sheeple. I'm the only person that's clear-headed. Well, really, but you're deluded is what you are, right? It's possible for ideology and class to be articulated together in a way to produce a social force capable for a time of self-conscious unity and action in a class struggle. So again, we can be effective. We're not just kind of stuck where we are. The aim of a theoretically informed political practice, and this is where we really get into the activist idea here. So, what if you're a cultural analyst, and one of the things you want to do, again, is not just understand culture, not just analyze it. That's fine if you want to do that, but what if you actually want to change things? So you see inequality everywhere. You're concerned about 1% having all the money, whatever it is. What can you do about it? Is there anything you can do about it? And Hall would say yes. But you have to approach things in an intelligent fashion. And here's his view. So the aim of a theoretically informed political practice must surely be to bring about those forms of politics and ideology which might lead them in practice to intervene in history in a progressive way. And articulation has to be constructed through practice precisely because it is not guaranteed by how those forces are constituted in the first place. They can become historically as effective as collective social agents. In other words, we can make a difference. But if you want to make a difference, then what you have to be thinking about is, again, these temporary linkages. There's nothing necessary about it. There's no just intrinsic reason for these things to come together. Instead, it's a lot more complications involved. These sort of weird alliances, what's the word? Strange bedfellows that might form sometimes. You never know who you might find yourself allied with. But during that little period, maybe this articulation that comes together can have an impact. So we're well beyond this idea that sort of the means of production is what drives everything. Here we're just kind of looking almost like an electron cloud or something, and all these atoms that might just suddenly spark together and make some kind of intervention in history. So it's a pretty interesting view. And this is the kind of contrast. There's a lot of theorists out there who basically say that there's really nothing we can do. Everybody's just sort of trapped in ideology. There's no way out of the box. It's just delusional to think we might have any kind of impact on history. All you can do is just kind of suffer. You really don't have any individual agency. You really have no power at all. That's sort of a negative, sort of cynical view that a lot of people, a lot of theorists seem to have. But Hall seems to be saying, or actually not seeming, he's definitely saying that that's not true. We can, but it's just a little bit more nuanced and more complicated than we might like. And so we make history, but on the basis of anterior conditions which are not of our making. Practices how a structure is actively reproduced. So he wants to avoid fetishizing practice and structure, avoid the rigid, mutually exclusive distinctions. Try to be more flexible, try to be more versatile, I suppose. Be okay with it, just saying, I don't really understand how this works. Don't try to nail anything down, because as soon as you do, it's going to break the linkage, right? People are not irrevocably and indelibly inscribed with ideas that they ought to think, the politics they ought to have or not, as if these were already imprinted in their sociological genes. The question is not the unfolding of some inevitable law of history or the march of ideas, or whatever, but rather these linkages, which, although they can be made, need not necessarily be made. Not a class in itself. I like this. Let me try to back up here. So we're not talking about classes in themselves, class as a class, but a class in itself, but as a class for itself, capable of establishing new collective projects. So some really interesting and deep thought here. It's probably still a little hazy, and what we're talking about with articulation theory, that's fine. We'll get more into it in these other chapters, but just to end this video, I want you to think about what we said about articulation as Hall is talking about it here. What do you make of this concept? And then as somebody interested in rhetoric and composition, and teaching, writing, or language, how might this be a useful concept? Again, not just for understanding culture, but to actually make an intervention, to do something, as it were, to improve the lot that we find ourselves in. And so I'll leave it there. And again, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or whatever it is, please share them. And I'll see you next time.